This summer, I've been preparing for my fall series tackling the controversial transgender topics of sports, prisons, and washrooms. Each of these raise their own unique considerations, but they all bring forward the common question of when and where it's appropriate to segregate activities or spaces on a sex-based criteria. And now, over the last few days, the entire world has been talking about another sex-based domain that I never imagined would have ever taken center stage. And that domain is chess. Why? The International Chess Federation announced that they are banning transgender women from participating in women's chess. If these individuals wish to participate going forward, they will need to do so in the men's league. Now, we could start with the typical discussion of whether transgender women or men, and thus which group do they belong in, but that would sidestep something way more fundamental. Why do we even have sex-segregated chess? Now, some people have argued that this makes sense because men are better than women at chess, or because women and men play chess differently, or because there are way more men in chess, so they are almost statistically guaranteed to win if both sexes play together. And honestly, I don't even know where to start with this. In general, most people agree that sex segregation, as a rule, is bad. We do still believe that, right? We have only relatively recently exited a historical context where everything in society was segregated by sex. Our workplaces, our societal roles and associations, and certainly our participation in hobbies and interests. And for the record, I agree that there are domains where sex segregation makes sense. And since transgender women are biologically male, in those domains, they should be aligned with their biological sex. And thus, the more pivotal question then is, when is there a basis to segregate by sex at all? And that is exactly what I will be exploring in my upcoming series on washrooms, prisons, and sports. But why not get started today with chess? Because other than the potential safety concerns of washrooms and prisons, many of the exact same principles apply. With respect to chess being sex segregated, I've broadly observed three flavors of argument. Argument 1. That males are biologically more predisposed towards chess and will dominate if we do not segregate because they are simply always going to be better at it. Argument number 2. That males are socialized into chess through their psychological, economic, and cultural upbringing. Thus, they are raised to be more equipped and better prepared to compete in chess relative to females. And argument number 3. That females, or at least some females, would simply rather participate in female-only chess. They just don't want to compete against males. Now, the biological argument is essentially the same as the sports argument, that men have a biological advantage that will lead to them often winning when paired against women. In contrast to professional sports, however, it is not nearly as clear whether a biological advantage is upheld in chess. There is conflicting research on whether there is any basis to biological males being inherently better at math, science, and chess-like activities. I've seen compelling arguments supporting each side of this discussion. It's challenging because unlike a test of physical strength or speed, it's very difficult to answer definitively because it's nearly impossible to isolate test subjects from the second category of concerns, psychosocial, cultural, and economic advantages that may lead men to performing better. If a given male performs better at swimming than females, we can relatively logically attribute a significant portion of that advantage to one particular physical feature, height. And height is sex correlated, but in the case of chess, it's not nearly so clear. But what is pretty clear is that chess is dominated by men, right from the lower levels of competition up to the most prestigious ranks. What many supporting chess segregation have argued is that the outcome is simply inequitable because men as a class regularly beat women as a class when they compete alongside one another. And that is measurably true. And the counter-argument to this has been that there is not a true psychosocial advantage and that the number of female grandmasters is proportional to the number of females who enter chess in the lower ranks. Thus, there isn't actually an equity concern at all. And I'm not going to engage with either of those arguments because I want to point out the elephant in the room. In both sides of the psychosocial argument, the E word has crept in to take center stage. And in this case, E is for equity. What has truly captivated me with this chess debate is how a crowd who vigorously argues against equity-based leveling has suddenly rallied behind it to champion this particular cause. We are very used to seeing equity-based arguments taken to favor racialized individuals, trans individuals, gay individuals, and yes, also female individuals. We see examples where black school dances have been held, hiring practices have been established to explicitly favor those of a particular ethnicity, race, or sex, and admittance to prestigious educational programs have been intentionally skewed in favor of LGBT or racialized individuals. And these incidents have enraged a particular crowd who point out that segregation is a form of discrimination, and discrimination is problematic even when done in an attempt to support what might be considered an underprivileged class. Here's the formula we see again and again. We observe that an outcome of a system is skewed towards a particular identity class, and then rather than thoughtfully grapple with the complex psychosocial underpinnings of that difference, we indiscriminately move to invoke class-based assistance, discrimination, or segregation to achieve the target outcome. I've done separate videos about group-based equity and the problem roots in using identity markers as a proxy for other human variations. This has been happening separately in favor of transgender individuals and female individuals for quite a few years, and skeptics have quite reasonably been raising concerns on both sides. And one of the biggest problems with this group-based equity approach is that intersections are not mutually exclusive, and the recent development with chess flips the equity arguments that have often been used to favor transgender individuals against them, and champions female equity instead. As a side note, this is why I have long long been against group-based equity approaches to social justice entirely. It feels pretty good when it's done in favor of a class one happens to coincide within, and it burns pretty hard when it's used against a class we have involuntarily been enrolled within. So what could we do other than group-based equity segregation? When we observe a difference in outcomes, we could address the root issue rather than meddling with the identity inputs to get the identity results that make us feel good. If men and women truly do, on average, play chess differently, which, by the way, studies do seem to refute, and if this truly does have an impact on both the engagement of the activity and the outcomes, then perhaps we need different competitions for different playing styles, because not all men play a particular way and not all women play in a different fashion. Likewise, not all men are economically or culturally predisposed to chess, and some women certainly do have this predisposition. Dividing on a men-women basis will inevitably mean playing to stereotypes that are simply not universally true. It's like using being black as a proxy for being underprivileged when that stereotype is not all-encompassing. There are poor white families and there are rich black families too, and if what we want to do is help economically disadvantaged families, we would be better off focusing on all underprivileged families rather than supporting black families as a proxy. Okay, I could keep talking about equity forever, but there's one more argument I need to touch upon before this video finishes. And that is the third argument, that some women simply prefer to participate in a women's only professional league. I actually really appreciate this comment because it speaks to a truth that many of us know is present, but we're not readily acknowledging. Sometimes we just like sex segregation because we feel more comfortable in those circumstances. We feel more at home or at ease or see ourselves more reflected within other participants. There's something soothing about the homogeneity of being in a club of people whom we can relate to and whom are like us in certain fundamental ways. And these arguments are also a little dangerous to lean into because while you might have sex-based preferences of association, others have race-based or cultural-based or religious-based preferences too. There are individuals out there who would prefer to participate in activities, employment, education, and beyond with only white people or Indian people or people who practice their particular creed. What exactly makes sex-based preferences more valid than these other types of preferences? And I frame that as a legitimate question because I really do empathize with this sentiment. I agree that on average, men and women can have very different ways of interacting in social spaces. Trust me, I know this very well, as psychosocial reasons were the #1 influence in my decision to transition. I'm not like most men, I don't understand them. I don't fit in with them, and I don't emotionally relate to them in the ways that they seem to relate to each other. And that is where we have an inherent conflict. Some people would prefer to participate in white-only activities, some in women-only activities, and some in Portuguese or Vietnamese-only activities. And at the exact same time, other individuals have an acclamation towards the same activities or ways of interacting that might be most commonly done in white circles or female circles or Vietnamese circles, despite not being bestowed those vertically inherited identities. It's both inevitable and acceptable that in private circles, people will naturally group as they feel most aligned. But the question at hand in washrooms, sports, prisons, Girl Guides, festivals, and chess is when and where we are willing to endorse institutionalized segregation. And when making that consideration, there are so many vectors we have to keep in mind. Fairness, safety, biological imperatives, psychosocial conditioning, and in some cases, our ever-growing obsession with institutional group-based equity. This muddied water of conflicting factors is why it's so critical that we take a good hard look at what basis we are willing to segregate based on sex. And that is exactly what I'll be doing in my upcoming series. Quick end note thought, my daughter was in Montreal for a few weeks this summer, and she brought me back this elephant.